Okay. Let's begin, no?
Okay.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm truly delighted to be here today with all of you, the author, our distinguished discussants, and the audience, both in Liège and online. Thank you all for being here for the presentation of Massimo Leone's latest book, Semiotic Ideologies, Patterns of Meaning-Making in Language and Society, published by Brill in 2024 as part of the book series Semiotics, Signs of the Time. I will begin with a brief introduction of the author. True, I imagine that most of you are already familiar with him. Massimo always laughed when I introduce him too precisely or at length, especially when I list all his visiting professorships. I will do not do it today.
It happens
I will
only
be brief.
in Liège. Only in Liège.
Massimo is a full professor of philosophy of communication at the University of Turin and a part-time professor of semiotics at Shanghai University in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature. He is also the director of the Center for Religious Studies at Fondation Bruno Kessler and an adjunct professor at the Andrés Bello Catholic University in Caracas. Additionally, he is the principal investigator of a major ERC consolidator grant titled Face Aesthetics in Contemporary Technological Societies, which began in 2019 and concluded with its final wonderful symposium last October at the magnificent Castello del Valentino. This ERC project, which explores the representation of the face in technological societies, has enabled him to assemble a talented team of PhD students and postdoctoral researchers studying the relationship between the face, social networks, and artificial intelligence. Furthermore, he has secured a second ERC grant, a proof of concept grant focused on the use of technology for the elderly. Massimo's academic background is rooted in semiotics, art history, and visual semiotics in the structuralist tradition. He is one of the most prominent disciples of Omar Calabrese. However, from an early stage, he has also worked extensively on the relationship between images, culture, and religious studies. This interdisciplinary approach has led Massimo to significant research on images and colonization in Central and South America. Semir invited you for a great conference. I remember very well about the images in the history of colonization in Central and South America. But he also worked a lot on images and religious fundamentalism. His work on images, religious conversion, and more recently the face has been widely translated into several languages, including Chinese and Persian. He himself writes fluently in at least 5 languages: Italian, English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. He's the author of 13 books. I will not list them, but I will recall Religious Conversion and Identity, the Semiotic Analysis of Text, 2004, Routledge, Saints and Signs, a Semiotic Reading of Conversion in Early Modern Catholicism, De Gruyter, 2010, Semiotique de l'âme, Langage du changement spirituel à l'aube de l'âge moderne, several volumes, Presse Académique Francophone, Annunciazioni, Percorsi di Semiotica della Religione, Arachne, 2014. 2014. He is the editor-in-chief of the major Italian journal Lexia, co-editor of the prestigious journal Semiotica, and director of the Routledge book series Face Studies. I will not list all the university where he has been a visiting professor or visiting scholar, but I will mention that he is currently in Hamburg at the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study, and that, much to our delight, he was a visiting professor here at University of Liège in 2023. I'd like to say a few words also about our discussants, who are all, without any hesitation, very generous scholars and truly brilliant. Not everyone knows each other, so I think it's worth doing. Marion Colas-Blaise is emeritus professor of linguistics and semiotics at the University of Luxembourg. Marion Colas-Blaise is the author of numerous publications in the fields of theoretical, literary, and visual semiotics, enunciation, linguistics, stylistics, and discourse analysis. Among others, she co-edited L'énonciation aujourd'hui, un concept clé des sciences du langage, 2016, and Répétition et reproduction dans les arts et les médias, 2021. She is also the author of a recently published book in 2023, a book we had the honor of publishing here in Liège in the semiotics book series Sigilla, whose title is L'énonciation, évolution, passage, ouverture. In this book, she re-examines the notion of enunciation, particularly through enunciation linguistics and semiotics, and it offers a comprehensive overview of the major theoretical shifts it has undergone over the past 60 years. Konstantin Nakassis is a professor of linguistic anthropology at the University of Chicago. He's building an important theoretical work in linguistic anthropology based on Michael Silverstein's heritage and semiotics, notably Persian semiotics. His fieldwork is mainly South Indian culture and politics, analyzed through Tamil film production. He wrote two important books. The first one, published in 2016 by the Chicago University Press, is entitled Doing Style, Youth and Mass Mediation in South India, where Costas, through intimate ethnographic descriptions of college life in Tamil Nadu, explores acts and objects of style such as brand, fashion, English slang, and film representations expressing the in-betweenness of young people exposed to globalization. This book has been translated in Italian and curated by Aurora Donzelli, a linguistic anthropologist, semiotician, and a friend. His most recent book, On Screen, Off Screen, is a seminal work on film theory, on the reciprocal relationships between cinematic text and the political domain. The good news is that Costas prepares a book in French. He's also co-editor-in-chief of the important journal Semiotic Review, for which he is the co-editor with Megan Barker, of an important issue entitled Images, which is an ongoing issue as the other issue of the journal and welcomes further articles. And he will be soon the editor of another issue on the dialogue between Persian theory, linguistic anthropology, and Greimassian semiotics. I could not imagine when I began to participate in 2022 to the annual seminars and symposium organized by Costas at the Paris Center of the University of Chicago, that the intersection, divergences, and compatibilities between these theoretical traditions would have reappeared in Massimo's latest book, so well examined. François Provenzano is a professor of language sciences and rhetoric at the University of Liège. His research trajectory is highly complex and multifaceted, spanning language sciences and communication studies. At the beginning of his academic career, his scientific career, he worked on language and politics. He wrote an important paper on the imaginary of the political imaginary of enunciation theory. But at the beginning, he worked on the role of the French language in French-speaking countries. Notably, he authored Vie et mort de la francophonie in 2011, and also in 2011, Historiographie périphérique, enjeux et rhétorique de l'histoire littéraire en francophonie du Nord, Belgique, Suisse romande, Quebec. His research also focuses on urban social semiotics and the politics of urban atmospheres. Another key area of interest for François is the rhetorical critique of discourse. He is currently co-PI of a research project on media education. His latest book, written in collaboration with Semir Badir and Stéphane Polis, explores linguistic imaginaries and gestuality, and is titled Les discours de la linguistique, gestes et imaginaires du savoir, Lyon, France, 2024. Together with Semir Badir, I have collaborated with him on several research projects, including a Belgian-Brazilian study on syncretic discourse, and some other projects. Thomas Franck is a postdoctoral fellow in the research project directed by François and Julien Pierron, Mythologie de la transition énergétique. His area of interest are literature, discourse analysis, and philosophy of politics. He's the author of 3 books: Adorno en France, La Constellation, Argument comme dialogue critique, 2022. Les philosophes dans l'atelier, Sartre, Giacometti en miroir, 2021. Lecture phénoménologique du discours romanesque, rhétorique du corps dans les romans existentialistes, les nouveaux romans, 2017. After this brief aperçu of our distinguished discussants, let us return to the reason of our meeting, the presentation of Massimo's books on a concept, semiotic ideology, which is well known and widely studied in the US, but less so in Europe, except at L'Assito in Paris, where Costas had some very nice colleagues, and to a lesser extent at ICAR in Lyon, that has for a long time directed by Pierluigi Basso, our plenary speakers of this morning. Massimo approaches the topic of ideology on the language and culture from the perspective of semiotic anthropology, which extends the theory and analysis of traditional linguistic anthropology to include nonverbal language. It is evident that linguistic anthropology also has always had a syncretic multimodal object of study, as one of its crucial questions concerns the thickness of interaction. So the semiotic heterogenesis. However, I believe that the perspective of a semiotician such Massimo, who is primarily rooted in European traditions, can shed a new light on how this scholarly field, this American scholarly field, can be redefined in Europe. At the same time, it may offer something new or complementary to Lodmanian and post-Gramscian semiotics. This book is crucial for many reasons, some of which are beyond my role to discuss, but particularly for the one I just mentioned. If linguistic anthropology is largely Jacobsonian and Persian, then the convergence of this American approach with 2 distinct European semiotic traditions has been taking shape primarily through this book. These traditions, despite their differences, share the ambition of illuminating the mechanisms of meaning, each selecting different clusters of description, that is, the relevant parameters that guide segmentation and analytical direction. These, and obviously that take into account the different levels of organization of semiotics, such as text, practices, and forms of life. These parameters vary in how they determine the, we could call, figurative and plastic density and variability of semiosis in the scope of the description. In this regard, Massimo, this is my first and unique question, in this regard, Massimo states in this book that, I quote, culture as a fractal nature, the inner structure of the microtext diffused in a culture closely resembles the inner structure of the semiospheric macrotext of that culture. Before turning the floor over to the real discussants, I would like to open the debate asking Massimo a very general question about the role of singularity, or in Jean Petitot's terms of non-generality, not only in this book, but in his unique singular theoretical approach to semiotics. Is a singularity which can be able of linking the different levels in a fractal organization. How to imagine in this topological model a transversal movement between one level and the other of the fractals. This transversal movement between macro and micro, for instance, is an enunciative act in my view, because it encompasses a sort of point of view, a guidance, an orientation in the reciprocal exchange between the two levels, the macro and the micro, the macro and the micro. More generally speaking, how to describe the va-et-vient, in a sense, between the macro and the micro in this topological model. E ti lascio solo.
Well, first of all, I must say that I'm really humbled by this occasion, this opportunity that I owe to the generosity and friendship, first of all, of Maria Giulia, who is the real queen of world semiotics. And I'm also humbled by the attention and generosity that I'm receiving by the distinguished colleagues whose exceptional paths and careers have been just evoked, and not even to the full extent. So thank you very much. I don't deserve all this attention. I'm a little bit embarrassed by it. So this embarrassment will probably influence also the way embarrassment and emotion and joy will set the tone for my answers as well, which will be particularly joyous. And thank you, Maria Giulia, for this first question, which is probably one of the questions. I've always been fascinated by change. This is probably why I've devoted so much energies and time in my career to study religious conversion. It wasn't because of a theological, spiritual interest, not even an interest in religious studies, but I was interested in radical change and how through disciplines that are very comfortable with static situations and environments and phenomena, perhaps including texts, which are a form of staticness, may also ambition map change, model it, and even provide some clues and hypotheses about its dynamics, without conflating with history, which is, of course, the human, especially Western, but not only, discourse on what happens through time, and to the record of it, and to the possible causes and effects. Of course, there is a lot of focus on change in natural sciences, and there is also a transition of concepts between humanities and natural sciences. But I think it's a real challenge to try to say something about the macro dynamics, but also the micro mechanism that somehow give rise to change. And so we have to posit a certain regularity in culture, because otherwise, on the one hand, we couldn't even aim at mapping it. We couldn't make it into an object of study. And also, we couldn't explain why, after all, even subjectively, we feel things like cultural atmospheres. We feel something like a zeitgeist, which is, perhaps not exactly as the zeitgeist has been defined, but we have a very empirical and concrete impression that what surrounds us presents some regularities and trends. And as we enlarge the scope of our view, we don't focus only on our neighborhood, but also on our city, on our country, on our continent, on the world. We can distinctively see that there is a family resemblance among many phenomena that take place at the same time, and that seem to have same structure, which is invisible and difficult to grasp, but that produces effects. So, to give you a very banal example, I'm not going to take examples from the book because I don't remember them, but it is clear, for instance, that what a threshold is, what a frontier is, what a limit is definitely changing as a concept, but also as an operational device these days, in many phenomena. So we can feel that a feeling and a semiotics of entrenchment is taking place, in so many areas of human activity. But this is just a feeling. Then, the issue and the challenge is trying to characterize that, describe that, and maybe do so in a way that is intersubjective. So we have to posit this regularity because it is our job, because we feel it. We feel that we are surrounded by a certain homogeneity. But at the same time, we have to explain what the hell happened that transformed everything, even in the short span of our lives. The world is completely different today than it was 20 years ago, of course. And it is not only in terms of particular aspects of the world and reality. There is a different conception, probably an implicit conception of meaning. What meaning is, what meaning does, and what role it has in societies and in human interactions. And so one has to posit regularity, but also some source of irregularity somehow. Like in the morning, we listened to a wonderful talk by Pierluigi, who, from a different point of view, much more precise than mine, and much more, much deeper than mine, is at least from my perspective, also trying to, grapple with that. We talked about emergence. We talked about the seeds of change that somehow appear in the midst even of a grammar, or even of a stereotypical manifestation of a grammar. And the more I move on, and then I'll conclude because I don't want to take so much time. The more I think that a error in repetition is certainly one of the main drives or main elements. Of course, we have to study it, describe it better, even name it better. But error in repetition is definitely what changes us in our biological dimension, because we are genetically machines of reproduction. We reproduce our genes, but there is also place for mistakes in this apparently perfect mechanism of reproduction. But those mistakes that, of course, we call mistakes, but are probably, not so, at least not morally. They're fundamental so that variety emerges in the midst of regularity. And so, I mean, biologists have actually pinpointed that quite well. I think it's very important that in our generation, scholars are focusing a lot on elements like noise, like irregularities, like glitches. Well, partially because we are surrounded by a very regulatory machine, which is the new digital machine. But also because, confronting ourselves with this new regulatory environment makes us probably underscore even more the importance of deviation from this fractal regularity, from this fractal interaction between different levels of meaning. And I would say that these glitches that take place between different levels of the fractal regularity of culture are those that, in the end, through tortuous and also difficult paths, give rise to instance of singularity, which is processual, of course. I wouldn't think of singularity as a static and ultimate state, but certainly something that can emerge and maybe solidify into a different regularity.
Thank you so much, Massimo. I would give the floor to Costas, who is our first discussant, and then to Marion. Je voudrais maintenant vous montrer Costas en grand, mais je ne sais pas comment faire pour un pin. Pin for me. Costas, we can see you. We can see you in the biggest screen.
You know your beauty. Finally, my head is as big as it feels. It's wonderful to see you, Massimo. I want to apologize first. Like Mark Twain, I ran out of time to write shorter comments, but you should take the length and the volume of my comments as an icon of the enthusiasm that I have for the book. So I wanted to start just by thanking Maria Giulia for inviting me to comment on this very ambitious book, but also to express my gratitude to Massimo for writing it. And in so doing, laying down an invitation across so many different disciplines and ways of doing semiotics. Now, I want to begin my comments on this very point, that this book, Semiotic Ideologies, Patterns of Meaning-Making in Language and Society, is a crossroads of many different kinds of semiotics. But what is a road? A road is an infrastructure that connects places. This makes it not a dyadic relation, however, but as an infrastructure, as a kind of phatic semiosis, it makes it a triadic relation, a semiotic relation. A road mediates what it connects as a third. In particular, it construes and constitutes a kind of indexical sign, taking as its ground a secondness, a real connection, as Peirce put it, of relata in spatio-temporal contiguity. Now, the old saying, all roads lead to Rome, comes to mind, even if Massimo is from Liège and teaches in Turin. Yet while the focus of this saying is typically put on Rome as an imperial destination, arguably from our perspective, and as regards Massimo's book, what's really important is not the center of emanation or the telos of travel, but the relation itself. That is, what's important is all those roads. There was no Rome without its roads, after all. So the first thing I'd like to say about this wonderful book is that it less sets a destination or final origin for semiotics as it lays down a network. There is no final end to inquiry, as Massimo notes in various parts of the book where he reflects on the epistemology of semiotics. Rather, there is a community evolving in perpetuity, a community of thinkers and a network of ideas that the book curates masterfully. Peirce, Saussure, Lotman, Helmsleth, Barthes, Grimas, and Eco, among others, are all woven together in a fine tapestry, gracefully, with an ease that's jarring if you're used to seeing such names opposed to each other as the totems of rival groups or schools. Now, few can do this as well as Massimo, maybe because we lack the vision that can see beyond the typical divisions and barriers and silos that we set for each other. But it's not just these already known scholarly camps that Massimo lays down roads between. Indeed, Massimo has charted territory into destinations far beyond the continental imagination, with intercontinental paths mapped between the hermeneutics of Chinese literary studies and the work of American linguistic anthropologists. It's from the latter that the volume's keystone concept is borrowed, as Maria Giulia noted, namely the concept of semiotic ideology. Now, myself, as a linguistic anthropologist who's also been interested in crossing the chasms that Massimo takes with a single leap, this book, for me, is an inspiration and an encouragement that there can be traffic on these fallow paths. Indeed, that this is a two-way road. So I applaud Massimo, who with this book has done major infrastructural work for all of our disciplines to bring us closer. Now, I don't want you to think, however, that this is just a synthetic work, a book that mediates between other destinations. It's not. It's something more. As the road is a sign relation, indeed an interpretant embodied in the traffic that moves across its surface, and as every interpretant translates, in Lotman's sense, a more developed sign relation, insofar as it construes, indeed theorizes what it connects, this book uses the above-mentioned infrastructure, this network of diverse semiotic traditions, to trailblaze into territories yet unknown. The book is dazzling in its semiotic erudition, but even more dizzying are the sheer number of topics and social phenomena that are covered in the book's 19 chapters, from religious painting to Chinese poetry, selfies to souvenirs, service encounters in Italian post offices to fructarian diets, cinematic text to online social networks, European parliamentary design to urban Chinese landscapes of nostalgia, from the semiotics of déjà vu to the semiotics of copies to the semiotics of faces to the semiotics of IKEA furniture instructions. There is a lot in this book. The book's larger claim, which brings together this cornucopia, is that semiotics can fully unlock the significance and significations of all these various phenomena and more only if it includes into its analysis the notion of semiotic ideology, namely those socio-historically contingent conceptualizations about semiosis that are part and parcel of social life. So now let me turn to this concept ideology and do so by setting out from my own base camp, linguistic anthropology, in order to meet Massimo on the road. Now, ideology, of course, is a relatively old concept, though not older than the French Enlightenment. Coined by the aristocratic political economist and philosopher Antoine Louis-Claude Destutt de Comte de Tracy, ideology was the name de Tracy gave to his philosophical system, the science of ideas. De Tracy was following in the lines of Condillac, the sensationalist philosopher who himself, working in the groove set down by the great British empiricist John Locke. Now, Locke himself was a philosopher and apologist of what became classical political economy and liberal political theory, but he was also a father of semiotics. Indeed, Locke coined the term semiotics, and it was Locke who was at one of the bases of both Saussure's doctrine of the arbitrary sign, as the intellectual historian Hans Arsleff has pointed out, but also Peirce's own semiotic. Ideology, then, for semiotics has a veritable genealogy. Now, as we know, Napoleon saw ideology as one of his key enemies, and he attacked the ideologues. And here, note the transformation of an abstract noun into a status term for a social group and type of person. So Napoleon saw ideology as one of his key enemies, and he attacked the ideologues as bearing dangerous ideas that were set to undermine his rule and authority. Through his political attack on ideology, Napoleon's usage resignified the term. And registered through this enunciative praxis, the term itself came to mean something else. It stopped denoting the universal meta-science and meta-language that would analyze all ideas and relations, and became instead a term for a partisan, interested, and situated form of politics, a real conspiracy, as Napoleon put it. To use the terms of linguistic anthropology, ideology took on a second-order indexicality, pointing to a particular group, the ideologues, and with a pejorative connotation that eroded the very semantics of the term. Indeed, it inverted it. It's this usage, of course, that Marx took up in his time in castigating the German ideology as an alibi for bourgeois capitalism, as a meta-discourse that was untrue and politically convenient for a certain social class, as dangerous ideas that, when disseminated, blocked the true science of socialism by serving as a form of false consciousness. Now, it's this sense, this higher indexical order of falsity, interestedness, false consciousness, that has been handed down to us in our everyday talk. So ideology is a heavy term. It's loaded down with a lot of indexical baggage. It's curious then that the term reemerges within linguistic anthropology in the late 1970s and flourished in the 1980s and 1990s and has continued to develop into the present. Yet this concept of ideology was not the ideology of old exactly, as the term was used and became used with a rather distinct meaning and purpose that was different from the ideology critique of Marxist approaches. Ideologies in this technical linguistic anthropological usage is not false consciousness that must be struck down in order to reveal the truth, nor is it the science of ideas that does that striking down. In 1979, Michael Silverstein published what became a seminal article, Language, Structure, and Linguistic Ideology, where he introduced the term ideology to denote one dimension of what he called, in reference to Marcel Mauss and Emile Durkheim, the total linguistic fact. The total linguistic fact names the non-resolving dialectical relations between language structure, linguistic practice, and language ideology. For Silverstein, this was a genuinely triadic relation where each side of the triangle mediates the others, and where you can't have any one without the others. Now, for Silverstein, the relevant reference, however, was not immediately Marx nor Discutants, though both loom in the background, as I'll note in a moment. Rather, the major reference for Silverstein was Benjamin Lee Whorf and his intellectual grandfather, Franz Boas. Silverstein's essay reclaims Whorf from the vulgar interpretations of the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that populated and continue to populate the uninformed public scientific imagination about what Whorf wrote. Instead, Silverstein showed how Whorf laid the groundwork for conceptualization of a workable semiotics of language and culture. Now, important here is how Silverstein demonstrates the way in which intersecting structural, grammatical facts of language afford particular uses, or what Whorf called fashions of speaking, that give rise to particular ways of experiencing and reflecting on language by language users in and as they use language. Ideologies on this view both emerge from the structure-practice nexus, even as they act back on both, by serving as the frame within which the social indexicality of language is constituted and construed. Here, language ideologies set the terms of meaningfulness on how linguistic practices are interpreted by users, i.e., given to them a social meaning or an indexical value. Such indexical values, moreover, enable and constrain how language comes to be used, and through this ultimately exert force on linguistic structures and cause historical change. At the same time, such ideologies, as partial construals of the facts of language and its usage, are themselves constrained by the organization of language itself. Our consciousness of language, in other words, is mediated by language structure, though not in any straightforward deterministic way. Indeed, only through the refraction of contextualized purposive language use. Now, why call this ideology? There are a number of reasons for this, but the first thing I want to emphasize is that if this is ideology, the form of this argument is less akin to Marx's German ideology and more akin to Marx's account of commodity fetishism in Capital. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx tells us that the structuring of exchange relations under capitalism constrains individuals' experiences of exchange in actual events of economic practice. And further, that reflections on such experience tends to focus on the commodity form rather than the wider exchange relations within which the commodity comes into being. Economic ideologies like classical political economy of Discutants or of Ricardo, these emerge as rationalizations of this structure-practice nexus. But if so, note that fetishes are not epiphenomenal, nor are they untrue per se. Indeed, they are performatively constitutive of how capitalism works. For it's the commodity form that enables capital to produce value, that is, to produce itself through these circuitous, if effaced, exchange relations. There is no capitalism, There is no exchange value without commodity fetishism. No economic organization without those partial situated views or ideologies that drive the value process. Just as there is no language structure without discursive practices and vice versa, nor indexical values without ideologies that construe and constitute them. The reflexivity of users to their own practice, thus, is the key to any account of language and communication, because such reflexivity is the very engine of semiosis, whether it's economic or linguistic. You can't study language without attending to this aspect. Indeed, without situating analysis within a particular culture of language. There is thus no privileged view of language from outside of it that does not already theorize the inside of the experience of language users to its use, that is, of language ideologies. Now, to Massimo's point about historical change, it's important to note that Silverstein saw this as an account of historical change, since ideology, as it emerges in particular pockets of a speech community or semiosphere, is not simply a force that reproduces language structure or renders it static. Rather, as a partial misconstrual of the facts of language that constitutes language as a social object, language ideologies are a dynamic, destabilizing force that's continually reorganizing language as a system of signification, action, and thought. Now, in the 1980s and 90s, Silverstein's notion of ideology was taken up and transformed by other linguistic anthropologists. And here I would stress that the uses and meanings of this term, as Massimo himself points out in his introduction, were not always the same as Silverstein's, nor was the uptake of the term simply due to Silverstein's usage or the force of his argument. Indeed, to understand why ideology became so important in linguistic anthropology at this time requires that we look at the historical disciplinary context in which the term came to do a certain amount of work. In particular, what's important is the extensive and devastating critiques of the culture concept that were made in 1980s American anthropology. Culture came to be seen among anthropologists as a deeply problematic term, for it assumed a kind of sharedness and homogeneity that it imputed to the groups studied, a kind of implicit contract or conventionality that privileged homeostasis and thus papered over contestation, internal differentiation, and the processes through which sharedness was itself possible, processes of power and oppression in which anthropologists were themselves sometimes complicit. Culture came to be seen as part of the exoticism of the field and its colonial collusion in managing difference. And largely the field abandoned the term, though not completely. Now, by contrast, ideology aimed to get at the situated, perspectival, fragmented, reflexive, and political aspects of semiosis, while also conserving the important function of the culture concept to explain how meaning-making and social relations are mediated by implicit metasemiotic normativities, which are highly variable across time and space. Now, the reason I go into this long digression, and I apologize for doing so, is because it raises a set of questions about how we might think about how ideology does work in the project inaugurated by Massimo. So the first thing to underline is that ideologies are partial objects. As Susan Gall and Judith Irvine point out in their magisterial 2019 book, Signs of Difference, ideologies never come in the singular. They are always plural, in dialogue and in contestation with each other, precisely because they are imbricated in processes of semiotic and social differentiation. Part of what this means is that ideologies are not isomorphic with a culture or a society. They are not worldviews. They do not start from sharedness, but rather from variation and differentiation, to Massimo's point in response to Maria Giulia. So the sociological unit of an ideology is not a very straightforward or clear thing. Ideologies are not things that individuals or groups have or hold. And why not? Because groupedness is itself the product of a semiotic process that is formed through the mediation of ideologies that are themselves internally in flux. It's also because ideologies are themselves semiotic resources that are invoked in and by communicative action by purposive actors. Ideologies do not stand outside of communication, but are immanent to it. They are reflexive processes that are at play, but also constantly shifting within semiosis. They are thus the organization of perspectives on communication that constitute semiotic grounds and thus are always situated, situational, and multiple. Here, the focus thus cannot be on demonstrating that ideologies are relevant for meaning, or even trying to discover what the ideology of some group is, but rather the question of how semiosis is mediated always by an ideological dimension, by those situated construals that emerge in and across events of semiosis. Now, this raises a couple of points and questions that I would invite Massimo to expand upon in relationship to the book. The first is the methodological question of how do we study the how of ideology? Where and how can we discern this reflexive aspect of semiosis, not as a code that stands behind meaning, nor as a static worldview or culture that imprints itself on a society or its members, but rather as a dynamic element that's intrinsic to communication, as an evenemential process involving agentive, purposive actors in interaction. Second, how can we bring the multiplicity of ideologies into view to highlight the fragmentation of the semiosphere? Or put otherwise, if cultures or groups are formed from semiotic processes, how are semiospheres themselves the effects of ideology rather than the encompassing envelopes of them? That is, how do we avoid the siren song of culturalism that tries to unveil the ideology of some group? Third, where do ideologies come from? In some ways, this is an impossible question to answer, but I raise it because all of those who have used ideology as an analytic scalpel, be this Destutt de Tracy, Napoleon, Marx, or Silverstein, each of these thinkers has conceptualized ideology with respect to an account of from whence ideology emerges. If ideology is a dimension of semiotic process and is semiotic itself, and if all semiosis is mediated by other sign processes, then what is the process within which ideologies emerge, congeal, get institutionalized, travel, are undone, disappear, and so on? And finally, what is the epistemic place of the analyst, the semiotician, the anthropologist in all of this? Now, there's an irony in the reflexivity of ideology, and here I think the complex epistemology that linguistic anthropologists have developed in theorizing the notion of ideology is helpful and important. This epistemology eschewed the idea that there could be an unproblematic view from nowhere, a scientific objectivity that could brush away ideology, subjectivity, and falsehood with a simple gesture. Indeed, this epistemology reformulated ideology not as what had to be banished in order to do science, which is the leitmotif of anyone from Boas to Bloomfield to Chomsky till above, but rather ideology had to be seen as part and parcel of our object of scientific study. This means that analysis has to move within ideology in order to trace out its functions. Yet in doing so, this raises the question of whether scientific inquiry as a semiotic practice is not itself mediated by ideologies. Now, it's important to underline that the conclusion from all this is not that science is not possible, that nothing is true or false, or that everything is just a free-for-all of interpretation. Indeed, the position articulated in linguistic anthropology is quite close to the position of Umberto Eco that Massimo elaborates in the book. After all, both are forms of semiotic realism that come out of the American pragmatist tradition. Rather, the conclusion is the one that Peirce came to. All inquiry has to be based around fallibilism, around the mediated movement of pressing doubt and provisional belief, which is to say, on a kind of humility and openness to difference. And here, let me quote from Massimo's acknowledgments. Quote, "Traveling with open eyes and attentive spirit is the best antidote to a discipline that tends to universalize its own cultural assumptions." So here I would like to invite Massimo to expand on this point, in particular in relationship to his experience in China, but perhaps elsewhere as well. And I'm particularly interested as how this point concerns how we might think about ideology not only as part of our object of study, though this is an important first move, but also as part of our scientific, indeed methodological ethics. So this is the ethical question of how we come to know and how we must make ourselves open to knowing in a particular way. So that's a first set of points. And I just, in wrapping up, just want to turn to two other issues that follow from these first set of points that I hope Massimo can also expand on selectively as he sees fit. And these will be very quick points. Now, above, I just spoke about the epistemic place of the analyst. Here, I want to ask about how this book understands the political place of the analyst. A recurrent stance of the book is that an analysis of semiosis from the perspective of ideology allows the semiotician to articulate normative judgments about the object that is inquired after, as well as to offer suggestions for its amelioration or rectification. For example, semiotics allows us to, quote, debunk the pernicious rhetoric of irrational persuasion, quote, to get rid of pernicious ideologies and astute demagogues, so as to let reality speak through the mistakes of human interaction with it. To confront, quote, cognitive populism, to denounce, quote, the anorexia of political discourse and of the academy as neoliberal consumerism. That the, quote, only reasonable task for intellectuals is to constantly warn their communities against the lure of fueling a trend without counterbalancing it by reference to opposite movements, end quote. Or that semiotics should take the stance that, quote, those who do not limit themselves to add variety and creativity to the game, i.e. social life, but instead disrupt it by disrespecting its basic rules, should neither be welcome nor tolerated. Exactly, for their action is not stimulating the adaptive creativity of human society, but on the contrary, introducing stiffness and aridity through the dismantlement of any potential for public hermeneutic, end quote. So here the question is, once we take ideology into account in our semiotics, does this change the job of the semiotician? Does it require us to take a political stance? Is our job ideology critique in the old Marxist sense, among other things? Is our job to defend liberal democracy? Or is it something else? A related theme in the book is the centrality of contemporary digital culture, as Massimo was also gesturing to in his response to Maria Giulia. A persistent focus of the book is how digital ecologies, infrastructures, norms of communication, and ideologies of the digital are impacting the contemporary world. Often Massimo's tone is cautionary, sometimes it's critical, with the digital representing at times the undoing of our social fabric, as creating new forms of anomie, demagoguery, conspiracy theories, the undermining of the ethics of truth, experience, and science, the disembodiment and disenchantment of semiosis into digital simulacra, and the engendering of new forms of consumerist narcissism. Now, in these chapters, the digital emerges as a major challenge and opportunity, not only for ourselves as citizens, and these are all things that we should all be very deeply concerned about, of course, but also as semioticians of the contemporary. So I'd love to hear more from Massimo regarding the centrality of the digital to 21st century semiotics. What are the particular challenges of the digital to our semiotic theories? And how can the concept of semiotic ideology help us meet those challenges? So let me just conclude by reiterating how grateful I am for the opportunity to engage with a book that so deeply and thoughtfully reflects on our semiotic condition, as well as for the opportunity to return the invitation that the book issues between continental semiotics and North American linguistic anthropology. And I'm looking forward to hearing Massimo's thoughts, but also to continuing the conversations in this vein far into the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Costas, for your deep engagement. Massimo.
Well, I'm really moved by the depth and the kindness and the magnanimous gaze projected onto my modest book, and above all because it's coming from what we have learned now, and with unanimous consensus to receive as one of the finest intellectuals in our global community of, let's say, meaning thinkers. I'm really indebted to this fine reading, which is grasping some crucial points of the book and is actually revealing them to me, because this is what happens in a dialogical interaction with a fine spirit like Costas, and in these wonderful events like the one that Maria Giulia as organized. And it's the best outcome because, of course, the conversation is much better than the book itself, which is what is supposed to be. Well, let me start probably with the first question. I have a psychoanalytical resistance towards the form itself of the book, to the point that to me it is very difficult to consider this book or any other books of mine as mine. I have a sort of a, I don't know if I call it embarrassment or shame or emotional and even visceral resistance to adopt the book as a form of expression, although I've put together like some books, but it is not something that I particularly embrace. I cannot really be satisfied because I think that it's one of those cultural forms that are deeply ingrained with a way of life and staying in society, which is the one of the sedentary. Of course, I don't want to go back to a very simplistic dialectic, but I must say that when I was a teenager and I read Bruce Chatwin, I was really impressed and fascinated by this very metaphysical contraposition between the nomadic and the sedentary. And I don't know how it emerges in the life of an individual, not a choice, but an inclination to go towards one polarity more than towards the other, which of course doesn't consist only in the fact of traveling. This it's not the traveling that makes the nomad. What makes the nomad is the visceral inability to embrace a ground somehow, which is a tremendous challenge in life. It is also a tremendous challenge as a scholar, and it is also a tremendous challenge in relation to all those cultural artifacts, a house, a book, a genealogical tree that, on the contrary, tend to draw a cartography, like sedentary cartography of meaning around an individual. It certainly pushes one towards a kind of sensibility that almost naturally gives rise to either anthropology or semiotics. I don't know why I chose semiotics in the end. Probably it was contingent, but it was also because I wanted to inhabit a tension that I saw at work in anthropology as well, but that I could see somehow exacerbated in semiotics, which is, or at least it was given to me as a textual discipline, as a textual knowledge, with a certain amount of certainties, but that I had to somehow inhabit with a nomadic spirit, and that engendered a lot of contradictions in my life and in my work, which are not resolved. It's this is why I think this book, I don't really know how it came about, but it's certainly the fruit of a tremendous, almost physical tension between the acknowledgement of the importance of this, form that we find in semiotics, that we find in a book, that we find in our forms of living, and the idea that everything could be shaken, not only through a programmatic let's say, relativism or perspectivism, because this is really an easy choice. To embrace a semiotic ideology of relativism. On the contrary, you are pushed towards a sort of an abysmal thought in which the flux itself, which was correctly underscored by Costas, is an object that emerges from a certain semiotic ideology. And so one has to come to terms also practically, in practical choices of scholarship and choices of life about these contradictions. And certainly the fact of putting together this book by traveling, but also by meeting so many friends around the world, and staying in this community of germane spirits around the world, has made this task a simpler. So somehow relativize also the dramatic aspect of this, continuously changing landscape. Yeah, it is continuously changing, but at the same time, after so many years and so many decades, you have the impression that you are in front of one of those maps in which you find the red point that says you are here. And there are some maps which are particularly annoying, in which you see a complex landscape, and at the same time you want to move towards that landscape. And I always make fun of these maps that we find, especially in Venezuela with my wife, where there is this perfect representation of space, but there is no representation of where you are, in that space. So, in most circumstances, you have that kind of impression. But I think there is also a cumulative working on your own situation in relation to this flex, in relation to this multiplicity of science, texts, cultures, semiotic ideologies you come across during this tortuous path, that more and more gives you an idea that, you're not exactly in that red spot, but that red spot is something that cannot be taken away from you somehow. Despite the traveling, despite the encounters, despite the work on yourself, it is somehow the innermost definition of a certain, I would say, almost a metaphysical style of being into the world. I don't know if this is an answer, but it goes towards the direction of what I consider an impossible problem to solve. We have to somehow stay with the semiotic trouble. I don't want to quote Donna Haraway, but it's the only way probably to keep working and at the same time enjoying our work. To stay within this tension between the text and the flex, between the usefulness of defining a semiosphere and the awareness of the fact that we ourselves as semioticians are the outcome of a certain way of understanding how meaning is to be handled in the world. And so this awareness should not be paralyzed or paralyzing. This tension should not be paralyzing. And this is, I think, the probably not theoretically definitive, but pragmatic, encouraging point. The fact that you can stay within these contradictions, you can stay within the trouble, and at the same time move forward, which is, an important part of our struggling with meaning and our understanding of it, which is this moving forward. This is something that I think is part also of this dynamic idea that is within semiosis. Yeah, it is a dynamics, but it's also an impetus. And I think this impetus part is important. The fact that we are inhabited and we inhabit contradictions, but at the same time we must somehow taking a direction. And as regards the political aspect, well, I'll be a little bit shorter on that because it's not so maybe from my point of view, not so difficult to answer. I think that in relation to the same passage that was quoted before, certainly our disquietude and our, let's say, being into the world also as political agents, or at least as political speakers, should be particularly relevant in those, and particularly prominent in those moments in which this, rebalancing of the world and rebalancing of the semiotic ideologies of the world is somehow clocked, I would say. I was really inspired as a young student, and I would say also in my work with a political aspects of meaning configurations and semiotic ideologies, by the work and the mystical thought of Simone Weil, this idea of rebalancing always the gravity of the world by staying on the other side. And I'll give you an example, but it's very provocative. But for someone who has been always very, let's say, mild in taking a very extreme political stance in what has happened about protests in Italy or in the United States, for instance, at Columbia University, or sometimes I've even felt the urge of rebalancing or putting a way of a different rationality against what I would consider, the wave of unrestrained flux of political stance towards one way or another. Well, now, when I, for instance, come across the news that a student of Columbia University whose political ideas I particularly dislike, I find them not resonant at all with my worldview. But when I read and when I have to, believe what I read about the way in which he has been arrested, well, that's a moment of rebalancing that is due even beyond the resonance with a particular set of ideas or semiotic ideologies of this individual, because it manifests something that pushes. So it manifests something that pushes the semiosphere in which we are living towards a point which is of extreme imbalancing, which is of extreme reconfiguration, which somehow menaces and threats to dismantle something that is fundamental for our being together. So this is, of course, also part of a particular semiotic ideology. It is probably also a remote and anyway very reflexive consequence of having been raised surrounded by a predominantly Catholic culture. But what disrupts the community, whatever the community thinks or wants to elect as a political stance, whatever somehow endangers the very idea of being together as human beings, the very idea of the possibility of putting together a community, that finds me particularly, let's say, reactive, also from the political point of view. So I would say that, more than espousing a political cause, I espouse a semiotic cause. I really believe that there are some basic semiotic conditions that must be preserved if we want meaning as we have studied it, as we know it, as we have also appreciated it in some manifestations of the past, to continue, and not to be thwarted. So I would say it's a semiotic engagement more than the political engagement, or it's politics through semiotics. I was very resonant to what I'm going to quote him again because I was really impressed by what Pierluigi said in the morning, and I was very resonant with the kind of stance that he had towards artificial intelligence. You know, it would be very simplistic to be, let's say, on this spatial bodily dialectics on the left, on the right, being conservative, being progressive. Even the idea of liberal democracy, I don't think is, let's say, general enough to encompass what I mean by the idea of having to preserve a certain a semiotic arena. Certainly, the model of the semiotic arena is different in China as it is in the United States today, but it is something that doesn't prevent a certain idea of community in China, as it doesn't prevent a certain idea of semiotic community in the States or in Western societies to coalesce. But of course, you know, a different move is when you don't play the game of this human interaction and human exchange of meaning anymore, when you're trying to replace meaning with something else, you know, and this is something that for someone who has studied meaning and semiotics all his life is particularly unacceptable. The idea, for instance, that brute force takes the place of semiotic interaction. So, you know, somehow pernicious persuasion is not, you know, an evil in itself, but because it is already a sign of the fact that this idea of, you know, somehow causing change in reality or causing change in society, not through the triadic relation of meaning, but through the dyadic relation of force, is somehow taking place, is at least gaining some momentum and gaining space. And I think this, you know, preservation of a triadic relation is very, very important in our work. We should react in any circumstances in which we have the impression that human relations are somehow deprived of this fundamental triadic dynamic. Well, I could give many examples, but certainly, you know, like if you think about slavery, is probably the utmost idea of a dyadic dimension imposed on another human being.
We have your confessions, Massimo, your testament and confessions.
But this is crucial, I think. So thank you. But because you just precisely you just said that, and I agree with that, or at least I have the same fear that the very notion of meaning have changed these past 20 years. So I'm not sure and it's also crucial for us, for François and I, when we are studying linguistic discourse, that we also saw that the linguistic discourse are completely changed and not in, for our point of view, not in a good direction. So how can you say that you are involved with the meaning sphere or the semiotic engagement, and in the same time observing to have the constatation that the meanings now has completely changed?
No, I understand. This is attention as well. This is attention as well. You know, when I was talking about inhabiting attention, I think that this is a wide tension, and the wider it is, the more awareness you have. So, of course, you could have a very particular view about the role of, let's say, the markets in the economy and defend that. There are people who defend that, but I don't think that would be our work as semioticians. On the contrary, when we realize that, for instance, defending the markets instead, let's say, of a planned economy, like this is a political position, but it's not abstract enough, I think, for a semiotician. But when you realize, and I think I'm realizing these days, I'm sorry, but we cannot really avoid the news, that here we're not talking about dialectics between the markets and planned economy. We are talking about a dialectics between chaos and order, or at least a modicum of predictability and a total absence of predictability, which is so disruptive that both sides, those who are for a planned economy and even those who are for the markets, do not live in fear of that. They live in angst of that. It is a fear of something that you don't know. And so I would say that all these situations of angst are our real, semiotic objects, not fear, but angst. And, even taking the traditional, quite rigid, but still useful definition of Freud, when semiotic conditions give rise not only to fear, but also to angst, meaning that there is no meaning in that anymore, and it cannot be found. I think that is a place in which we cannot possibly coexist. It is a place of violence. It is not a place of direction, whatever it can be. In that moment, in that circumstance, society starts to disintegrate. Whatever, the set of, and so it is a particular semiotic ideology that is somehow conducive to disrupting the same idea of what a semiotic ideology is. So it's somehow leading to a situation in which there are no more semiotic ideologies, because what is there is an interaction of forces that cannot be neither internally nor externally be read through a semiotic scheme whatsoever. It is the return to a physics of forces, which is not our job, and it cannot be our job.
Before giving the floor to Marion, I'm going to do.
Sorry, it was long.
I will change laptop, but I hope that the laptop by Enzo will. Okay. Enzo.
They haven't listened to this.
Non pensi? È il tuo che dobbiamo fare. Bisogna togliere il microfono.
Also, a third, please make all maybe about it.
Hai dato le tue. Io mi sono detta, se muore abbiamo tempo. Come faccio? Parliamo. Ma non è possibile. Because my laptop has no longer energy.
Do you want me to mute your laptop, Maria Giulia? I can mute it from here. Is that the problem?
Mute Enzo.
Enzo is muted, but I can mute yours, and then you can.
Yes, yes.
If we
Costas.
do so, it's okay?
Now we can hear. Now we can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
So it's just to conclude briefly, there were, of course, in other aspects And the third question, but I'll address it probably in our like future exchanges.
Yeah,
with
Massimo, we can
Costas.
talk more later. We'll talk
Yeah,
more later.
yeah. Just to give space to, but thank you very
course.
much. You know, these were
No,
really
thank you.
crucial directions.
Marion, we are really delighted to listen to your comments. We already know that you did a wonderful compte rendu of the book. So please,
Thank you very
go
much.
on.
Thank you very much, Massimo, for your wonderful book. Thank you, Maria Giulia, for your invitation. As I published a scientific review of Massimo Leone's book in the latest issue of the scientific journal Semiotic, Maria Giulia asked me to be brief and concise, to take just a few minutes, first of all, to engage in dialogue with Massimo. I think that Semiotic Ideologies offers a powerful and original reflection, excellently documented and sometimes more exploratory, on contemporary, past and future ways of producing meaning and sharing it. This is the main focus of the book. At the heart of our thinking are meaning and the absence of meaning, collective representations brought together in ideologies and systems of meaning, as well as the circulation of meaning. The ways of producing meaning are both recurrent and changing. Massimo, you talk about meta habits, particularly in language. According to you, the semiotician has got a mission. He should reveal. You want me to stop?
No, Marion. We listen to you.
We hear you.
We are listening to you. We try to control the sound better, but
Well, then I was saying.
It's better?
I was saying that Massimo, you want
c'è qualcosa che non va. It's we understand you well, we listen to you well, but there is a small sort of echo. It's not so impossible to follow, but as we change the laptop.
Maria Giulia, why don't we mute your microphone while Marion is talking? I think that'll probably help.
I think it's okay. I think it's okay.
No, it's okay. It was Enzo found the solution in the room.
So,
sorry, Marion.
So according to Massimo, the semiotician has got a mission. He should reveal through analysis practices that have been normalized or standardized to the point of becoming invisible. He should act by denouncing or even preventing the breakdown of meaning, extremism of all kinds, fundamentalism, populism, the phenomenon of exclusion, anonymization, by studying their discourses. You brilliantly contrast cultural areas that are sufficiently distinct for the investigations to have a more general scope. This includes everyday gestures as well as verbal and visual texts. How do you proceed? I won't dwell here on the theoretical and methodological frameworks that enable you to analyze different kinds of ideologies, temporal and spectral, spatial, relational, etc., and even indexical ideologies, which vary according to cultural context, or scopic ideologies, depending on the actants observed and the scales adopted. This point has already been covered by Costas. Let us simply note that your book aims to develop a new theoretical framework, which it puts to the test in a wide range of linguistic and non-linguistic fields. I find it particularly interesting that in the chapter devoted to spatial ideologies, you successfully adopt an ethnosemiotic methodology that you situate at the crossroads of post-structural linguistic studies and ethno-anthropological research, combining semiotic anthropology with ethnographic observation. My first set of questions concerns the notion of naturalization. Let's consider the context. In order to analyze more abstract phenomena such as time and space, the agency of speakers acting on the world around them, as well as concrete manifestations such as conspiracy theories or fake news, you reveal patterns that play a role in the production of meaning. Patterns. Intentionality is not anarchic, you say, and we need to be anarchic, you say, and we need to be attentive to the prefigurations of patterns by cognition and culture, chain semiosis, chains of interpreters in the sense of peers, where each choice has a retroactive effect on the previous one. You then write that it is important to recognize cultural patterns in a methodological, even scientific way. You establish a link with the natural sciences, not at least because semiotic ideologies constitute, I quote, naturalized habits of producing meaning. So I would like to ask you, if the contents whose ideological character has to be revealed are too often perceived in an illusory immediacy, as in the case of evidence, as if they escaped convention and arbitrariness, would it then be possible to link this naturalization to an indexicality that underpins the meaning of science, text, and languages? Finally, would it be relevant from a different theoretical point of view to study the affordantial nature of habits, the entanglement of ideologies and affordances? Does the affordantial anchoring of meta-habitudes lead us, in certain cases, to no longer question them, and thus reinforce this invisibility, and ultimately the blind assumption of ideologic choices? My second set of questions concerns arbitrariness and, more generally, a dynamic review of ideologic basis. Massimo, you explore fields as diverse as art, architecture, history, politics, law, education, food, medicine, economics, and finance, not to mention religion, always with the unwavering aim of raising awareness of structures that evolve over time. Not so much an awareness of an unchanging syntactic and semantic framework, but rather an awareness of a fundamental dynamic sustained by active dialectics, for example, between tokens and types. Your diagnosis is both worrying and extremely pertinent. I quote, "It is increasingly urgent to rationally expose the cultural mechanisms of mystification, to underline the social need that they currently satisfy, and to propose viable antidotes to them." This sentence alone sums up the great ambition of your book. The aim is nothing less than an in-depth understanding of human universals, apprehending time and space, remembering and forgetting, concentrating and extending, including and excluding, perceiving, showing and representing, communicating, exchanging and sharing, or hiding from others, in line with the semiotic ideology of transparency and obscurity. The aim of meta-analysis is to decode culture using new tools. It is a question of being sensitive, even beyond the text in circulation, to what you call cognitive dispositions that are inseparable from expressive articulations. In the aftermath, I find particularly relevant your considerations on arbitrariness, also in the perspective of the generation of text and images by artificial intelligence. Hence, a second set of questions. Is arbitrariness perceived as such by humans because of a lack of adaptation of the models of intelligibility to the complexity of certain phenomena and just changing scale? You are defending this position, I believe. But also, is there such a thing as arbitrariness, so to speak, in itself, due, for instance, to an indeterminacy inherent in the code itself, even when the machine does what it has to do, and therefore independent of human reception. If this seems obvious for computational creativity, as in the case of glitches, can we also consider that there is a form of arbitrariness connoted very positively in poetic creation itself, which acts against the sclerosis of meaning and allows renewed semiotic productions, thanks to a paradigm shifts. I quote, where there is an unfiltered or at least unfilterable meaning beyond ideologies and perhaps even beyond ideas, you say. And you add the following, poetry is a living, impregnable, gracefully singular butterfly, a position based on an extensive development on singularity. I find the discussion of singularity of token and type very stimulating. You want to ensure that you capture what you call the adorable singularity of literary texts by opting for high fidelity interpretation. What part does arbitrariness play in this process? Under what conditions? Provided that some kind of arbitrariness enters the definition of creativity, and that it is accompanied by a permanent renegotiation of content, thanks also to expressiveness. The process of Wi-Fi interpretation, for example, in the case of Wikipedia, leads you, on the contrary, to regret the absence of any room for negotiation despite collaborative writing. A third set of questions. The interplay of iconicity, indexicality, and the symbolic dimension on one hand, and the power of imagination on the other. Iconicity and indexicality. You conclude by comparing, on the one hand, verbal systems, which in a particularly powerful way use arbitrary semiotic means to render iconically the dialectic between phases of ontological time and between aspects, and on the other hand, non-verbal systems which use simulacra. What about the agency of the latter? This question raises another. What is the power of imagination, and what part does the imaginary play in shaping ideologies and overcoming them? It's interesting that you talk about the imaginary transportation to either the past through remembrance or the future through fiction, I quote. The very switch that is blocked by what you call the cultures of the present. Would you also agree that any ideology which can be defined as a set of representations would in itself refer to an imaginary that includes a fictional dimension from the etymology of fictio, production, and imagination? And finally, does the imaginary help to overcome ideological underpinnings, acting as a ferment at the root of innovation? This leads me to a fourth set of questions. I would like to ask you, Massimo, about the link between ideologies and norms. You deal in detail with the question of the normativity of gesture. More broadly, to what extent does ideological overflow constitute a deviation from a norm that is not only statistical, but also semiotic, I would say semantic and contextual, prescriptive and proscriptive, objective and subjective? More so, in what way does, I quote, ideological excess define the coding normality of a social group and vice versa? Would you agree that ideologies are at least sometimes abnormal phenomena that are revealed insofar as they deviate from norms, it has common sense, and that in return they act on existing norms, modifying them and creating new norms? In other words, would the excess due to an intensification, as semioticians would say, that characterizes ideologies guarantee, through the deviation from norms, an evolution that is inherent each ideology being subject to a process of de-ideologization, ideologies are undone, and perhaps a new ideologization in another way. In short, is it possible to highlight the dynamics to which ideologies in their excess are subject by analyzing norms which are themselves caught up in a movement of de-normativization, but normativization is undone, normalization, description of regularities and irregularities, and new normativation? Are we talking about a dynamic in which ideologies and norms come closer to each other temporarily, interacting before separating again, when with norms serving as the normal underpinnings, habits for excesses, meta habits? To conclude in a few words, I find your book extremely stimulating and brilliant in many ways. In particular, regular incursions into the field of new technologies provide interesting insights into the way in which digital technology changes our habits, our very being in the world and with others, our way of perceiving and apprehending time and space. And so, does digital communication make almost instantaneous exchanges possible? One of the developments that I find particularly relevant concerns the constitution of communities, communality, you say, through digital social networks. You notice that it is above all a question of being there, belonging to a community, whatever the motivations, with no semantic basis for a shared communality required. In an age marked by fake news and conspiracy theories engendering widespread mistrust, I quote, "Syntactic connectedness risks placing opposition to another, declared to be the enemy, at the heart of the constitution and maintenance of falsely community relations. A feeling of boundedness is exclusively begotten by a sense of common opposition." A very accurate observation that calls for other analysis of the social, cultural, and aesthetical consequences of the current takeover of social networks, and more generally of the marked interest in new technologies intermingled with apprehension. As you put it in a paper entitled Semiotics of the Black Box on the Rhetorics of Algorithmic Images, I quote, "By delving into the semiotics of algorithmic images, we uncover the nuanced ways in which these images serve as sites of negotiation between human and computational intelligences, reflecting and shaping societal norms and values." Massimo, to conclude, I would like to pass on your appeal, which I think is very important, also in the light of the collective research we have been carrying out as part of the Paris seminar over the past 2 years. You call on us not to, I quote, "underscore the importance of a critical perspective towards the epistemological and ontological questions raised by the increasing pervasiveness of algorithms in our digital culture. It calls for re-evaluation of the ways, you say, in which visual rhetoric and algorithmic authority co-construct our perceptions of reality, knowledge, and power in the digital age. By critically engaging, you add, with the implications of algorithmic authority, we pave the way for a more nuanced understanding and interrogation of the digital landscape that shape our contemporary existence. Maybe you can comment on this further. Thank you very much.
Massimo, you need to unmute the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, Massimo.
Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but Maria, Julie, and Enzo are performing miracles here. I want to reiterate my thanks to you, Marion, for the wonderful review that you wrote for the journal Mosaic Semiotique, and it was really a very thoughtful and in-depth reading of the book. And I also thank you for these further comments, which of course are naturally coming from the amazing systematic and very precise knowledge that you have of our semiotic field. So I'm really honored by this attention. I'm pressed to be extremely short, so I want to address in all the points of your comment, but of course I'll be very pleased to receive it also in a written form and reply to all the points, perhaps with an open commentary. I will probably start from the end because it allows me to somehow return to a point that was raised by Costas and to which I didn't fully reply. What I again, the kind of tension and contradiction that I tried to inhabit in dealing with the digital world was to avoid as much as possible the sociological categorization that already Umberto Eco tried to somehow ironize upon between apocalyptic views and integrated views, but with the consequence though that by refusing that, one may develop an awareness about the current place of the digital in many societies that is even more apocalyptic. And I'll try to explain myself. I think that, of all the debates that surround, for instance, the new role of artificial intelligence in our lives, and of course, Maria Giulia is doing a tremendous work, as you mentioned, in the Paris Seminar of Semiotics to stimulate a conversation on that. I think that, hearing all these debates and all these conversations, it is inevitable to feel that there is a certain polarization toward the stereotypical points of view, which are repeated with, different, pragmatic, even sometimes economic or, self advertising objectives. But the point is, what is the crucial semiotic question that we as semioticians can ask about the interaction between this new material infrastructure and the way we deal with meaning and the way in which semiotic ideologies circulate, emerge, fluctuate to take a more, let's say, hydraulic and liquid discourse, also inspired by Costas' wonderful words. I think that an interesting point of view is to somehow work on a particular semiotic perspective on the genealogy of artificial intelligence. So try to understand how we were artificial before becoming artificial. Somehow trying to understand what kind of semiotic ideology prepared the emergence of artificial intelligence, which is exactly the opposite of course, technological determinism. Not to deny that we are changing and our semiotic ideologies are changing, because there is this new technical and infrastructural reality. But in order to acknowledge the fact that it was prepared by a very long process in the history of semiotic forms and interactions. And I'll give you just one example. This idea of using the digital to somehow replicate the human, but not only replicating it, but also somehow purifying it, is a very old idea. It comes from very far. It is somehow an utopia, that takes a new shape through artificial intelligence. It cannot be compared with similar utopias of the past, saying that, well, it's exactly the same thing again. But certainly, this emergence is giving new power to a semiotic ideology that sees the necessity to somehow purify the human body and purify human interactions and purify human outputs through this, in itself, a semiotic element, which are numbers. This is very old, but it's taking new shape because this shape is somehow mediated by new forms, new texts, a new infrastructure that doesn't make these numbers visible to us anymore. When we interact with artificial intelligence, we don't immediately think that we are interacting with numbers, but we are actually interacting with numbers. We are interacting with an infrastructure that is turning the entirety of language into a network of numbers that is actually vectorializing natural language in order to be able to measure it in this vectorialized space. And so the real question, at least one of the questions that a semiotician should ask is, where does idea and desire of vectorialization come from? And I think it has a lot to do with a certain idea of purity, a certain idea of the fact that turning an apparently magmatic phenomenon into something that we can represent as a vectorial space, a statistical space, well, it's producing new certainties somehow. And I believe that this is an approach that is at the opposite of what structural linguistics first and structural semiotics after have been doing. Even the most, like as Grimassian semioticians, we have been accused many times of, projecting a too regular grid on meaning. But we didn't ever project a mathematical grid on meaning. Even when mathematics tried to have an interaction with semiotics, think about Petitot, René Thom, etc. It was the opposite. It was a semiotization of mathematics. It was a semiotization of topology. Because, the message that we have for the world deep down, which is probably also our semiotic ideology, is again that this cannot be measured. But we are more and more surrounded by manifestations of an opposite semiotic ideology that has many consequences, and that tells us, well, big news, we can now measure it. So sorry, it was a very, anecdotal, but I hope that through this example, at least I could somehow take the zest of some of the very interesting remarks that you proposed, and give a direction to the kind of answers that I'll give you, in a written form, open written form, and I hope also in future conversations we'll have.
Thank you very much, Massimo.
François and Thomas, please come here so we can record you during your speech. Probably Costas had to ask a question.
Oh, I just wanted to say very quickly that I liked this discussion very much, Massimo. Well, one distinction we might make is that there's many ways to do mathematics, and there's a difference between number and calculation in mathematics. I mean, for the Greeks, geometry was not a numerical science, it was a science of ratios and forms. So I think the critique of semiotics is mathematized. The question is, what kind of mathematics? And, a structural analysis has a mathesis to it, but it's not numerical. And I think that's where we are now. I think you're right. It has something to do about quantitative computing is the leap. It's not structural form, and that's why they're all, as you point out, they're all statistical models.
Yeah, I agree completely, and it is not unrelated to what I would say about force, because deep down I see this gravitating of public discourse on statistics or around statistics, and with this new power given by this fantastic, marvelous technology, is translating the same idea that, well, we can determine the force that wins. And this is, determining the force that wins, again, takes us to a conception of reality that even physics has abandoned. It is not closer to reality. The point is that, the real travesty is that, this conception of a measurable, statistically graspable a representation of reality, as if reality was a sort of a boxing game, or even more precisely, a chess game. This is presented to us as a realistic representation of reality, which is, I think, a travesty. Even natural sciences are abandoning this idea that, somehow a choice between alternatives can be made by just weighing them, by turning them into numbers, by turning them into measures. And, it's a very significant move that now language itself, it is mapped through a statistical model. This is an illusion that we semioticians must somehow debunk with all our forces. Language is not a statistic model. It doesn't work statistically. There are some interesting aspects of language that can be grasped statistically, but semiotics and statistics are, from many points of view, two radically opposed disciplines.
I am really glad to listen to François and Thomas.
Sorry, we made you wait.
No, that's perfect. First of all, I would like to apologize for switching now from English to French. We'll try to make our French as international as possible. But also the only way is to demonstrate the variety of our linguistic ideologies into the academic field also.
Sure. Voilà, peut-être pour commencer, remercier une nouvelle fois Maria Giulia et Massimo pour la sollicitation et donc pour l'opportunité de discuter d'un ouvrage dont les ambitions, le corpus et le cadre théorique sont assez impressionnants. Donc on aimerait poser avec François deux types de questions, j'espère qu'on aura le temps, on verra, deux types de questions qui sont vraiment le fruit de nos réflexions croisées à la lecture de votre ouvrage. Disons que les deux premières relèvent d'un niveau de généralité qui touche tant à la méthodologie qu'à l'imaginaire théorique et peut-être idéologique du travail. Les deux autres sont plus ponctuels et en phase avec nos domaines de recherche respectifs, à François et moi, à la croisée de la rhétorique, de l'analyse du discours, de la théorie critique et de la sociolinguistique, comme Maria Giulia l'a évoqué tout à l'heure. Premièrement, en guise d'introduction à ces questions, nous trouvons que l'enjeu principal de votre ouvrage est la question de l'idéologie qui sous-tend dans presque chaque geste culturel la reproduction de structures sémiotiques collectivement admises. Des choses qui ont évidemment déjà été évoquées, je le dis ici de manière très générale. Dans le même temps, il nous semble que cette force entraîne une difficulté qui réside dans une forme d'universalisation de la méthode à des objets extrêmement hétérogènes, localisés, parfois difficilement comparables. On l'a déjà évoqué, je pense que Costas, Nakassis et Marion Colas-Blaise ont évoqué ces questions. J'évoque juste en guise d'introduction la mise en relation assez vertigineuse de la marque Desigual et puis Don Quichotte, en introduction donc. L'idée d'établir des homologies structurelles nous semble autant ambitieuse qu'osée, au point que le formalisme mathématique, du moins le schématisme formel que vous proposez, risque peut-être de reproduire ce qu'il entend dénoncer, et que vous dénoncez d'ailleurs en début d'ouvrage, à savoir un subjectivisme créant par son regard l'homologie elle-même. Mais peut-être devrait-on accepter ce subjectivisme situé de l'ethnosémioticien, ou serait-ce faire œuvre idéologique? Je pense que Marion Colas-Blaise a aussi évoqué cette question autour de la normativité. Et on aimerait donc revenir, du moins pour ma part, j'aimerais revenir sur l'un des 3 dualismes que je vais évoquer ici maintenant et qui sont présents dans l'ouvrage Semiotic Ideologies, notamment les dualismes mythification-démystification, le dualisme universalisation-variation localisée, ou encore l'évidence du sens commun versus l'impertinence idéologique. Je vais donc me concentrer sur mythification, démystification, par souci de concision et parce que c'est aussi un des points sur lesquels vous revenez en fin d'ouvrage, avec cette idéologie d'une ontologie distincte d'une phénoménologie. Hein. En gros, ce qui est n'est pas nécessairement ce qui apparaît, ce que vous dites en conclusion. Ce qui, moi, m'a tout particulièrement intéressé est l'assistance sur le fait que les ressemblances, les régularités, touchent davantage les structures que les phénomènes eux-mêmes, donc les structures au sein des sémiosphères que les phénomènes en soi. En effet, dire qu'il existe des syntaxes analogues dans une culture donnée, dans une sémiosphère, cela permet de penser le rapport entre les macrotextes et les microtextes, on l'a déjà dit, Marie-Julie l'a dit, ce qui trouve pour moi, pour François aussi je crois, un écho avec les notions d'interdiscours ou de phraséologie en analyse du discours, mais qui dans le même temps permet d'étendre ces théories à des significations non langagières, et je crois que François va y revenir. En outre, et puis j'en arrive à ma première question, hein, en outre, le chapitre consacré au processus de motivation idéologique, qui fait passer à un signe symbolique, à un signe iconique, puis potentiellement à un signe adexical, est éclairant, il nous semble. Cela permet de montrer en quoi la réception, a priori intuitive d'œuvres culturelles, notamment d'œuvres religieuses, vous prenez l'exemple d'œuvres représentant le Christ, est en fait guidée par une relation sémiotique à l'objet, qui s'est construite sur de la motivation idéologique et culturelle, processus de motivation dont on n'a pas nécessairement conscience, ce serait le propre de l'idéologie. Ma première question est donc la suivante, par rapport à ce rapport entre rhétorique de la mythification et de la démystification. N'existe-t-il pas un 3e rapport entre cette mythification et cette démystification, comme il existerait un 3e rapport entre l'universalisme anthropologique et le relativisme localisé dont fait partie le chercheur, ou bien entre le bon sens rationaliste et la pertinence militante de l'idéologie, la pertinence militante de l'idéologie qui régit peut-être elle aussi le chercheur. Le bon sens rationaliste n'est-il pas une idéologie, tout comme le biologisme pragmatique qui est convoqué en dernier recours dans les conclusions? En effet, en pensant cette double rhétorique de la mythification-démystification, ne reconduit-on pas la vieille lecture marxisante de l'idéologie, selon laquelle il y aurait soit adhésion à conscience, c'est-à-dire mythification, soit distanciation critique, c'est-à-dire démystification. Et il me semble par ailleurs qu'on retrouve la marque d'une certaine théorie du reflet très lukáchienne à certains moments entre l'objet culturel et la sémiosphère dans laquelle il s'inscrit. Et pour reformuler d'une autre manière, n'y a-t-il pas, comme chez Barthes, possibilité de neutralisation ou d'adhésion-distanciation vis-à-vis de l'objet idéologique par le travail mythologique sur le sens? Voilà, c'est peut-être la parole à François. Ou alors,
De suite,
vas-y,
Bon, merci. Hein, c'est une question très, très centrale. Merci de la lecture. Moi, j'ai tendance à croire qu'il y ait une 3e position, oui. Mais je dirais que, pour l'évoquer, je dirais que ce n'est pas une 3e position topologique, c'est une 3e position, je dirais, temporelle. Sans être hegelienne, sans être dialectique à la façon hegelienne. Plutôt, si je dois trouver une inspiration, une source d'inspiration, je choisirais Augustin. C'est l'idée que, par exemple, dans les cas d'Augustin, mais je ne parle pas du cas religieux, mais bien sûr, c'est central dans les processus de démythification et des mythifications. Est-ce qu'on peut faire partie d'une communauté tout en étant extrêmement sensible vis-à-vis de ce qui la constitue, qui est un sujet que, bon, Augustin évoque de façon très, très élégante et aussi très, très frappante, hein, surtout lorsque je me souviens, dans un sermon, il commente l'épisode évangélique de la Transfiguration, qui est un épisode assez bizarre, parce que c'est les moments dans lesquels Jésus se manifeste en tant que divinité avant la mort. Et donc la question c'est pourquoi? C'est-à-dire, quel est les fondements? Et donc, bon, il y a tout un discours théologique, mais dans ces commentaires, Augustin s'identifie en fait avec la figure de Pierre. Hein. Vous vous souvenez peut-être de la plus connue représentation qui est celle de Raphaël, de la Transfiguration, avec Pierre qui est par terre, qui doit couvrir ses yeux. Et dans ce passage magnifique, lyrique, Augustin dit, bon, maintenant, Pierre, tu dois descendre sur terre, tu dois fatiguer, tu dois suer, tu dois te mélanger avec les hommes, tu dois continuer ton travail, etc. Qui est particulièrement difficile parce que tu as vu la divinité, donc tu vas travailler dans des communautés qui sont parsemées des doutes. Alors, ce n'est pas pour dire que nous, les sémioticiens, nous avons vu la transcendance ou la divinité, mais quand même, nous faisons partie de communautés très variées par rapport auxquelles, disons, nous sommes un peu, par des formations professionnelles, par un instant qui nous a amenés vers cette déformation professionnelle, amenés à décortiquer l'essence, à voir ces processus qui font en sorte que des idéologies sémiotiques s'invisibilisent, qui deviennent des habits culturels sans réflexion, des motivations, des créations, des pseudo-index derrière lesquels nous voyons qu'il y a une histoire, qu'il y a une généalogie, qu'il y a des alternatives surtout. Alors, le véritable problème, c'est d'abord faire partie de cette communauté, parce que nous ne travaillons pas contre les êtres humains, nous travaillons pour les êtres humains. Mais il faut travailler pour les êtres humains tout en cultivant cette soif, qui est une soif au fond de vérité. Alors, c'est un mot très encombrant, mais au fond, la troisième position, c'est une position où se réconcilent ces deux grands mots, d'un côté la vérité, de l'autre côté l'amour. Augustin le dit très très clairement, c'est par amour que Pierre descend vers les hommes après avoir vu la divinité. Et c'est par amour que nous continuons de rester, de lutter, de combattre, de prendre position dans des communautés, tout en témoignant les processus de la fragilité du sens. Voilà. Alors, comment expliquer l'amour? Je ne sais pas. Mais quand même, c'est un choix éthique. Je dirais même plus, c'est un choix moral. C'est le choix de l'amour vis-à-vis de la haine. Voilà. C'est vraiment très, très viscéral, très profond. Et peut-être que c'est un choix non plus sémiotique, mais moral. Je ne sais pas si... Je vais essayer de répondre. Voilà.
Oui, merci.
Merci beaucoup, Massimo. Alors moi, je crois que je vais devoir choisir entre une des deux questions que j'avais préparées. Il y avait une question un peu plus générale sur le lien entre idéologie linguistique et idéologie sémiotique. Mais peut-être je vais aller vers la question plus particulière qui concerne en fait deux chapitres de ton livre qui touchent à la question de l'espace. La question de l'espace comme à la fois comme matériau d'une idéologie sémiotique, mais aussi comme dimension exploitée par une idéologie sémiotique. C'est le chapitre 5, Semiotic Ideologies of Space, sur le shibboleth, les frontières invisibles, etc. Et le chapitre 13, qui porte sur la mémoire, mais où en réalité tu mets en contraste deux réalisations architecturales à Macao, le House of Nostalgia, et le casino qui imite une mini-Venise. Il me semble que ces deux chapitres, en fait, ils ont chacun, enfin j'ai trouvé qu'ils avaient chacun finalement deux points aveugles vis-à-vis de la question de l'espace. Dans le chapitre 5, donc celui sur les frontières invisibles, en fait, il me semble que tu t'intéresses surtout aux interactions humaines, dans un bus, dans un bureau de poste. Et ces interactions humaines sont là comme le signe que les sémioticiens arrivent à faire émerger, le signe des frontières invisibles au sein de la société, au sein des groupes sociaux. Et donc, l'espace, finalement, ici, est très métaphorique. Disons que les signes dont il est question sont ceux qui sont produits par des pratiques humaines, langagières, kinésiques, bien sûr, dans des espaces, mais ce sont surtout les interactions humaines qui sont là pour faire signe et qui font signe en tant que frontière. À l'inverse, je dirais que dans le chapitre 13, tu te centres sur les propriétés matérielles de ces lieux, architecturales, en tant que ces propriétés manifestent une dialectique culturelle propre à la société de Macao, entre le fantôme du passé et un ailleurs fantasmé. Hein. Mais il me semble que cette dialectique culturelle que tu lis dans les propriétés architecturales de ces lieux, il m'a semblé qu'elle laissait de côté les pratiques humaines qui s'inscrivent dans ces lieux, qui s'ajustent à ces propriétés, qui participent en fait aux effets de sens. En l'occurrence, la pratique de la visite pour la House of Nostalgia et la pratique du jeu, du gambling dans le cas du casino, qui est une pratique qui justement est là pour cultiver la déréalisation, un rapport à des formes de rationalité alternatives. Et donc, quelque part, on pourrait dire que l'architecture mini-Venise n'est qu'une expansion matérielle de cette pratique anthropologique qu'est le jeu ou le pari ou le gambling. Où est-ce que ça m'amène, toute cette lecture croisée? Ça m'amène à la question des syncrétismes par lesquels, il me semble, dans différentes pratiques de l'espace, notamment de l'espace urbain, plus ou moins ordinaire ou plus ou moins institutionnalisé. Donc, à travers différentes pratiques, il me semble qu'il y a à chaque fois des grammaires sémiotiques différentes qui se combinent, qui s'ajustent, qui se renforcent. Et peut-être qu'il y aurait aussi des variations culturelles à observer dans les idéologies du syncrétisme, c'est-à-dire les syncrétismes, par exemple, entre le verbal et le visuel. Dans le cas des inscriptions urbaines, par exemple, on pourrait se demander dans quelles conditions culturelles, idéologiques, en plus de conditions sémiotiques, dans quelles conditions donc une inscription urbaine devient une image ou se confond avec son support matériel ou intervient sur le plan des pratiques et des interactions humaines pour les contraindre ou pour les orienter. Et voilà, je trouve que ces deux chapitres sont intéressants paradoxalement par les blancs qu'ils laissent chacun l'un par rapport à l'autre, mais pour moi, ils ont, si tu veux, montré la voie d'une étude des idéologies des syncrétismes, notamment en lien avec les espaces urbains et avec ce que ces espaces urbains mettent en relation comme plan d'expression sémiotique. Voilà, c'était la question ponctuelle. Et puis, pour la question plus transversale, plus générale, je te l'enverrai par écrit.
Non, François.
No,
C'est un quarto. Puis j'ai envie d'entendre sur cette question-là.
Bon, ben, je vais essayer quand même, comme d'habitude, de passer au général. Alors, la généralité, ça consiste aussi dans le fait que, de façon non programmée, de façon spontanée, ces livres ont été projetés pour un regard amical. Et c'est pour ça que je suis très content aujourd'hui. Je ne sais pas dans quelles conditions je pourrais reproduire une telle perfection des réceptions comme aujourd'hui, parce que vous avez projeté sur ces livres le regard que j'espérais. Et bon, on est un peu naïf, enfin même un peu arrogant en pensant que ce soit le regard projeté sur cet ouvrage, parce que cet ouvrage a besoin d'amitié, dans le sens qu'il est plein inévitablement de lacunes, il est plein de manques, il est plein d'aspects que pour manque d'espace, manque de temps, manque d'énergie ou manque de compétences n'ont pas pu être approfondis. Donc, c'est un livre à compléter. C'est un livre à compléter. Et aussi, c'est un livre à contredire. Mais c'était la seule façon, peut-être, qui pouvait naître de ce style de vie et qui devient aussi une sémiotique idéologie en soi. J'ai essayé de l'évoquer un peu en répondant à Costas, mais bien sûr, il y aurait beaucoup à dire. Alors, je le dirais par exemple par rapport à ces chapitres sur Macao. Alors, si j'écrivais les cahiers qui ont amené à l'écriture de ce chapitre, je devrais dire que, bien sûr, c'est un chapitre sur les temps, c'est un chapitre sur l'espace, mais c'est un chapitre aussi sur mon corps, parce que ça naît d'une expérience extrême, pas extrême, mais bon, très inusuelle, d'un voyage à Macao. Il n'était pas un voyage académique, mais c'était un voyage de plaisir dans lequel, en fait, j'avais loué un appartement qui n'existait pas. Donc, c'était une fraude. Ça a commencé avec une fraude. Et ça a commencé avec un espace qui n'existait pas. Mais cet espace, c'était la maison temporaire. Et donc, alors, c'était une première confrontation avec, disons, les conséquences, non pas ultimes, mais disons, profondes de rejeter le lieu de la résidence ou de la stancialité. Après, bon, c'est un voyage particulièrement malheureux d'un certain point de vue, mais très heureux d'un autre point de vue, parce que ce voyage continue avec la réalisation que tous mes moyens financiers ne marchaient pas. C'est-à-dire, je n'avais pas d'espèces, toutes mes cartes bancaires ne marchaient pas, et j'avais aucun moyen de me faire envoyer de l'argent ou de raccourcir mon séjour pour changer mon billet d'avion et simplement m'en aller. Et donc, je me suis retrouvé à Macao avec cette condition de ne pas avoir une maison et de ne pas avoir de l'argent. Ils sont deux, disons, points d'appui sur la voie, disons, non pas nomadique, mais stanciale, lorsque nous nous projetons dans un espace hétérogène ou hétérologue. Et alors là, l'exploration de l'espace devient très différente parce que c'est une exploration qui a derrière elle un corps qui observe, qui analyse, qui essaye de comprendre la diversité culturelle, mais qui en même temps est parcouru par cette question corporelle qui est où trouver la nourriture, comment manger pendant ce séjour et où rester, où dormir. Et alors, là, à mon avis, c'était très intéressant parce que, bon, j'ai plein d'anecdotes, bien sûr, sur ce séjour, mais l'une des raisons qui m'avait amené dans ce casino, c'était parce qu'il y avait des mariages dans lesquels je pouvais m'insérer pour, pour trouver la nourriture. Mais ça, bon, bien sûr, c'est un peu... ça a été très amusant parce que j'ai été adopté par cette communauté, mais ça m'a mis dans une position d'exploration tout à fait différente parce que d'abord, j'avais la nécessité, mais de l'autre côté, ça faisait lire l'espace comme une matrice des sources possibles de nourriture gratuite, hein, et qui change complètement, disons, les paradigmes de l'attention qu'on peut mener sur l'espace. C'est là pour dire que, bon, disons, il y a dans ces croisements des regards jetés sur l'espace et des regards jetés sur les gestes qu'il habite, sur le corps qu'il habite, aussi un troisième regard qui est celui d'un déracinement profond d'une condition habituelle d'exploration, hein, qui est une condition assez confortable pour un sémioticien. Bon, en anthropologie, il y a toute une mythologie. Hein, Lévi-Strauss en est peut-être le dernier témoin de cette condition de manque de confort corporel dans l'exploration de l'espace. Mais ça crée une tension entre un chaos intérieur et disons, l'ébranlement d'une série de caractéristiques de tout un réseau que normalement on a autour de soi. Et l'effort quand même de reconduire cette situation qui est vécue, même du point de vue corporel, comme une situation des arrêts, des désordres, des chaos, à un certain ordre conceptuel, à un certain ordre. Et alors là, je crois qu'il y a quelque chose de presque mystique qui se manifeste parce que on se dit, je vais reconnaître l'essence même dans la fin. Voilà. Je vais reconnaître l'essence même dans l'insécurité. Je vais reconnaître au fond l'humanité. Voilà.
Non, journée importante parce que Massimo s'est dévoilé. Voilà.
Mais surtout parce qu'il
on a tout.
met pour chasse encore les organisateurs de ces mariages.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que tu veux ajouter quelque chose, Thomas? Non? Alors, on va être sûr, on va clôturer. Alors, c'était vraiment une journée d'amitié, de grande amitié. C'est comme ça que je l'avais conçu, effectivement. Mais je sais aussi que...
Alors, s'il y a encore
Oui, absolument.
Deux curiosités. Je n'ai pas lu dans l'intégralité ton livre, mais j'ai essayé de lire des chapitres et de voir un peu la structure de ton livre. Et par rapport aux questions aussi que tu as reçues, pour prolonger un peu les dialogues avec nous, tu as des curiosités sur deux mots que tu as bien utilisés dans les livres, et quels sont les poids théoriques, l'importance théorique que tu peux attribuer, que tu as l'envie d'attribuer à ces concepts. C'est le comparatisme et l'autre, c'est axiologie. Alors, la première chose, je voudrais thématiser tout simplement pourquoi j'ai des curiosités, entendre un peu ta réaction là-dessus, parce que tu as reçu des questions, par exemple, sur le fait que l'idéologie n'est pas seule. Normalement, il y a une contre-idéologie, qu'il y a toujours des... Et donc, pourquoi ne pas utiliser dans notre tradition sémiotique, mais tu le fais, hein, les termes axiologiques est bien présent dans ton texte, mais pourquoi ne pas privilégier les termes axiologiques qui renvoient à des choses importantes, à axios, être digne des valeurs, hein, la logique de la dignité, et aussi avec l'idée que l'axiologie est un système de valeurs, à travers les termes valeurs, les concepts de valeurs, on est déjà dans un réseau différentiel, et donc à travers les axiologies, tu as déjà une réponse par rapport, par exemple, à Costas, qui me posait une question là-dessus, et l'autre sur notre ressource interne en ton livre, le comparatisme, tu évoques, et parfois tu fais une analyse comparatiste. Finalement, le comparatisme est une réponse encore possible par rapport à cette idée que on a toujours une idéologie en tant que chercheur. Je veux dire qu'on est presque obligé à s'auto-dénoncer, à avouer que quand même on a une position idéologisée. Mais un comparatiste peut, à travers ses regards dans lesquels il cherche à mettre en comparaison de l'étrangeté, mais différente, un pluralisme. Hein. Est-ce qu'on peut sortir finalement de la piège, ou là, d'être toujours dans une position idéologisée? Voilà, deux choses qui sont présentes dans ton livre, et j'aimerais connaître un peu le...
Non, c'est en fait une remarque centrale et sur la comparaison, c'est quelque chose de très central disons, dans l'opérativité, même dans le faire presque inconscient de cette action de traverser les cultures. Donc, c'est presque un automatisme. Et ceci dit, c'est quelque chose qu'on peut relancer. Par exemple, je crois fortement au fait que maintenant, on doit comparer les intelligences, hein, l'intelligence artificielle, l'intelligence humaine. L'exercice des comparaisons est vraiment très important. Donc, peut-être on aura des départements d'intelligence comparée, hein, après avoir eu des départements de littérature comparée. Et donc, ça reste central. Et le concept d'axiologie, un peu plus technique, mais au moins, ça évoque aussi un autre type de public, c'est aussi important. À la fin, pourquoi, disons, miser sur l'idéologie? Un peu parce que, malgré tout, disons, malgré la parfaite description généalogique et Costas a fait avec son efficacité un peu des minutes de ces concepts, nous ne pouvons pas totalement détacher ces concepts qui est technique dans la sémiotique, dans l'anthropologie linguistique et aussi dans l'anthropologie sémiotique. À mon avis, on ne peut pas détacher les côtés moraux de ces concepts. Et ça pourrait être vu comme un défi pour, disons, les anthropologues linguistiques ou les anthropologues sémiotiques qui voudraient en faire un concept purement opérationnel ou technique. Moi, je dois dire que j'ai un peu choisi exprès de rester dans cette ambiguïté, de rester aussi dans l'ambiguïté que, disons, ceux qui lisent les livres, ceux qui entendent parler d'idéologie sémiotique, ne savent pas jusqu'au fond s'il s'agit de dévoiler des ensembles d'idées sur l'essence ou une prise de position morale sur le monde. Un peu parce que je crois qu'au fond, on ne peut pas vraiment tout à fait détacher ces deux éléments. Et l'autre, de l'autre côté, parce que peut-être il y a aussi cette directrice morale de laquelle je ne peux pas me débarrasser. C'est-à-dire, je ne peux pas me débarrasser tout à fait d'une empathie. Voilà, je le rappellerai comme ça. Donc, je peux comparer, je peux voir aussi les mouvements axiologiques, mais j'arriverai, je crois, jamais à me détacher de cette empathie qui peut être un problème, peut-être aussi une ressource, mais qui justifie, à mon avis, les choix du terme idéologie plutôt que du terme axiologie. L'idéologie, c'est une axiologie vers laquelle on a une empathie, de quelque sorte. Et ça, c'est quelque chose que, d'un côté, peut-être je ne veux pas éliminer, mais c'est aussi parce que peut-être je ne peux pas éliminer. C'est-à-dire, il y a des directions axiologiques vis-à-vis desquelles je ne peux pas ne pas réagir en sautant, disons, de la dimension de la comparaison à une dimension qui est, disons, au centre de la scène, au milieu des éléments, au milieu des choses. Et ça n'arrive pas souvent systématiquement. Ce n'est pas un livre politique, ce n'est pas un livre militant, ce n'est pas un livre engagé, mais c'est exactement le type d'engagement qui me caractérise. C'est-à-dire, il y a des directions dans la culture qui m'obligent à prendre position. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup de ce beau dialogue final. Merci beaucoup. Moi, je vais clôturer la séance. Costas, merci encore. We really were delighted. We really enjoyed your comments and your presence. See you soon. And have a nice time. Bye-bye, Marion, if she's there. And to the others who followed us this afternoon. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Maria Giuseppe. Thank you, Massimo.
Ciao, Costas.
Bye. Ciao. Ciao, Maria.